Insulin sensitivity didn't make a difference. People who secreted more or less insulin lost no more or less weight in general on either a low-fat or a low-carbohydrate diet.
Are low-carb diets and low-fat diets really the same? I was sent a video to review from Healthcare Triage, and the title is Sorry, but low-carb and low-fat diets get pretty much the same results. Well, that might be good, wouldn't it, if they're good results? But let's see. This source, Healthcare Triage, is a group, largely Dr. Aaron Carroll. They review studies and give healthcare advice. Let's see what they have to say.
The endless array of diets that claim to help you shed pounds tend to fall into two camps: low-fat, low-carbohydrate. Some companies even claim that genetics can tell us which diet is better for which people. A rigorous recent study sought to settle the debate, and it had results to disappoint both sides. The study's worth a closer look to see what it did and did not prove, and that's the topic of this week's Healthcare Triage. Researchers at Stanford University took more than 600 people, which is huge for a nutrition study, aged 18 to 50 who had a body mass index of 28 to 40. 25 to 30 is overweight, and 30 and over is obese. The study subjects had to be otherwise healthy. They couldn't even be on a statin or drugs for type 2 diabetes or hypertension, which might affect weight or energy expenditure.
I'm going to just stop here a moment. This is a study, I'm well aware of it. It's from probably the premier diet research group in the world that does randomized controlled trials at Stanford University, one of my alma maters. And Christopher Gardner is the lead author or PI or principal investigator, the lead of the study. And so, of course, with any study, you want to know where it comes from. Is it a respected group that is a group that has never done that kind of research before? But so at least this is a reputable source of research group.
They were all randomly assigned to a healthy low-fat or a healthy low-carbohydrate diet, and they were clearly not blinded to which group they were in. All participants attended 22 instructional sessions over a year in groups of about 17 people. The sessions were held weekly at first and then were spaced out so that they were monthly in the last 6 months. Everyone was encouraged to reduce their intake of the avoided nutrient to 20 grams per day over the first 8 weeks, and then slowly add the fats or the carbohydrates back into their diets until they reached the lowest level of intake that they believed could be sustained for the long haul. Everyone was following.
So, time out. By now, I hope you know, and I'm going to be speaking to you as if you were the patient next to me at Duke University. If you brought this video in, you were concerned about it, I wanted to talk about it, I would pull up the video in my office, and I'd also then kind of go through the methodology like this. A lot of studies are using low-carb diets that they've never actually used them in their own clinical practice, like I have for over 20 years. The research group here, that line that just went by really fast, is they started at 20 grams of carbs per day, and it was total, not net. For those of you who are into this world, there's a big difference between total and net carbs. If you're still counting the net carbs and it's not working, try total carbs. That's the tip for the day. Well, so they started at 20 grams and then increased the number of grams of carbs to where they thought it could be sustainable. Okay, time out. What you have to understand is that is now lowering the dose or the strength of the low-carb diet. And this is, you have to think of it as the lower you go on the carbs, the stronger it is. And so if people were allowed to change their own nutrition and their own dosing of their medicine, imagine, we're going to give you some pills, but if you don't like taking the pills, you can take less of the pills, is basically what they just said in the methodology. And I have to say, I'm going to be a bit critical of Professor Gardner and his group at Stanford because they haven't consulted people who've used keto diets or low-carb diets under a certain level. They haven't used consultants who've actually used the diets. And so I have to wonder what kind of counseling was going on and all that. In my office, I don't do any of this weekly counseling and all that. So a couple factors here. The methodology used here is not as strong as a typically used low-carb keto diet in a clinical practice like mine at Duke. So I'm not going to expect the same strength of results that I would if I, let's say you came back to me and you said, well, I'm having trouble. I don't want to eat any more eggs. So I'm going to add in some cereal. I'd say, no, don't add in cereal yet. Well, why don't you just have the bacon or sausage? Or did you know you don't even have to have breakfast if you're not hungry? Now, I'm pretty sure that kind of teaching was not part of a traditionally trained dietitian researcher like Christopher Gardner is. I'm going to do a couple videos, stay tuned for the next ones, to really get into Professor Gardner's thought process and thinking and preconceived biases, actually, or biases he brings from traditional background in nutrition. So basically they started at 20 grams low carb and then increased to what they thought was sustainable, which this is a big deal.
Everyone was followed for a year, which is an eternity in a nutrition study. Everyone was encouraged to maximize vegetable intake, to minimize added sugar, refined flour, and trans fat intake, and to focus on whole foods that were minimally processed. The subjects were also encouraged to cook at home as much as possible. All the participants took a glucose
about the cooking at home. I don't care if you cook at home. I don't care if you go to a restaurant, as long as you stay away from carbs. So the type of low carb or keto diet being taught has a big influence on the sustainability and the ability of people to adhere to it. The more difficult the program you create for somebody, and they don't know which element to relax on if time gets tough, then they're going to have a harder time sticking to it. And I'm afraid they were coming up with some sort of big deal of a low carb teaching, and you had to stay strict, and it just wasn't able to be taught in a simple manner, unlike the way I teach it and the way many doctors teach it in their offices. So let's keep going.
Tolerance test is a measurement of insulin sensitivity. Some people believe that insulin resistance or sensitivity may affect not only how people respond to diets, but also how well they adhere to them. The participants were also genotyped because some people believe that certain genes will make people more sensitive to carbohydrates or fat with respect to weight gain. About 40% of the participants had a low-fat genotype and 30% had a low-carbohydrate genotype. Data were gathered at the beginning of the study, at 6 months, and at a year. And at 3 unannounced times, researchers checked in on patients to see how closely they were sticking to the instructions. This was a phenomenally well-designed trial, and people did change their diets according to their group assignment. Those in the low-fat group consumed on average 29% of their calories from fats versus 45% in the low-carbohydrate group. Those in the low-carbohydrate group consumed 30% of their calories from carbohydrates versus 48% in the low-fat group.
Oh boy, 30% of calories from carbohydrates. So on a keto diet, if it's 20 grams or less, you're having about 5% of your calories from carbohydrates. So this was not a low-carb ketogenic diet sort of teaching. Or everyone started at the 20, which is keto, and then everyone increased the amount because they thought they couldn't sustain it. I mean, after all, where would you get your vitamin C if you didn't have fruit, right? This is the thought process. No, you get plenty of vitamin C without having fruit. So anyway, this is not a low-carb keto diet like the one I teach at my clinic, the one we've studied for the last 20 years and published papers on.
They did not, however, lose meaningfully different amounts of weight. At 12 months, the low-carbohydrate group on average lost just over 13 pounds, compared to more than 11.5 pounds in the low-fat group. The difference was not statistically significant.
Well, it's interesting. They both worked. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to kind of pull rank on being a doctor in an office, in a clinic where people come back to me and say it's working or it's not working. Sometimes results like this are a great victory, although remember the strength of the low-carb diet that they used here was not as strong as the ones that I see. So that the 1 to 2 pounds of weight loss per week, what I see in the clinic, is kind of at the low end of what they saw here. They saw at 12 months, the low-carb group lost on average just over 13 pounds. So, I see 1 pound per week. So this is a lot lower than what I would see in the clinic. I would see 50 pounds on average, 50 to 100 at 12 months. So it's a lot less strength of a low-carb diet that's being studied here compared to what I teach.
Not statistically significant. Insulin sensitivity didn't make a difference. People who secreted more or less insulin lost no more or less weight in general on either a low-fat or a low-carbohydrate diet.
Now that's an interesting thing because classically, historically, Dr. Atkins, who I met and actually asked him for research money some years ago, he was treating people who had insulin resistance. It's the most overweight people have insulin resistance, and a low-carb diet clearly worked. So here the idea is maybe if we segment out people who have insulin resistance or don't, maybe one diet will be targeting better. In a population like this, where there's going to be some insulin resistance for all of them, I think both diets, and it's kind of a minor, a weak low-carb diet, they're both going to work, and they're both going to work about the same. So it doesn't mean that a keto diet won't work better. And I don't play the one's better than another game. If you've tried a low-fat diet historically, you've been on Weight Watchers and other versions of low-fat diets, and they haven't worked, for goodness sake, try a low-carb diet, because it might actually fit your metabolism regardless of what the research shows. And I'm very skeptical, like this doctor is, about the genetic testing telling you what to do. I've had people go to 23andMe or Ancestry, and the diet they are told from their genes is, one that's low in red meat and high in carbs. Wait, time out. So the genetic companies are going to be asking the established researchers what the best diet is, and they're going to tell you don't eat red meat and eat mostly plants, because that's what everyone says is best, but it's not really necessarily the best. So I'm skeptical about the genetic matching as well. What you want to do is use trial and error. If you tried a low-fat diet, it didn't work, well, try a low-carb diet, and don't try a weak low-carb diet. Try a strong prescription strength low-carb diet like the one I teach.
Genetics didn't make a difference either. People who had genes that might indicate that they would do better on one diet or the other didn't. In fact, when you look at how every single participant in this study fared on the diet to which he or she was assigned, it's remarkable how both diets yielded an almost identical curvature range of responses, from lots of weight loss to a little gained. It wasn't just the averages. Some have taken this to prove that avoiding processed foods, eating more whole foods, and cooking at home leads to weight loss. While I'd like that to be true, because I've advocated that approach here on Healthcare Triage and in an Upshot article on food recommendations and in my recent book, which you should buy, that's not what this study showed. Although the advice was given to all participants, there was no control group in which that advice was omitted, and so no conclusions can be made as to the efficacy of those instructions. Others have taken this study as evidence, debunking the idea that counting calories is the key to weight loss. While that wasn't the main thrust of the study, nor the instructions given, participants did reduce their intake by an average about 500 to 600 calories a day, even if they didn't count them. This study didn't prove the unimportance of calories. The researchers also asked everyone, not just those in the low-carb group, to avoid added sugars. Therefore, we really can't say anything new about added sugars and weight loss above what we've said in many episodes before this. What this study does show is that people who've staked a claim on one diet's superiority over another don't have as strong a case as they think.
Well, hang on. The study that we did, it published in 2004. I know, it's a long time ago, and have been using it ever since because we published papers on what we do, randomized trials. And Dr. Yancey is the first author on the paper I'm thinking about, and it was a prescription strength low-carb diet, the one actually Dr. Atkins was using at the time out of his office. So it's 20 grams, total grams or less, and you keep people at 20 grams or less for 6 months, compared to a low-fat diet where we kept the calories controlled explicitly. And in that study that we did, and in most of the studies that are published through the last 20 years, the low-carb diet actually does better in terms of weight loss. So if you did a meta-analysis actually of all these different studies, and there are at least 4 meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials, the low-carb diet does do significantly, statistically significantly, and clinically significantly better in these research studies. Now, you can actually do better than the research studies, is one of my main points from watching this doctor do a great job of picking apart a research study, but he doesn't understand that there are different kinds of low-carb diets, different strengths, and the researchers that had a program, made people come back and listen, probably created a kind of a difficult straw man, if you will, of what to follow. And if you didn't watch, didn't have your 3 meals a day, you might have been ashamed a little bit about, you didn't have 3 meals a day, when I don't care if you have 3 meals a day in a practical kind of program.
It's hard to overstate how similarly these two diets performed even at an individual level. It shows us that the many people and the many studies suggesting that we can tell which diets are best for you based on genetics or based on insulin levels might not be right either. Almost all of the studies
Totally agree.
All of the studies that backed up such ideas are smaller, of shorter duration, and less robust in design than this one. Granted, it's still possible that there might be some gene discovered in the future that makes a difference, but those who think they've found it might want to check their enthusiasm. This study was focused mostly on people who are obese or overweight, so people looking to lose just a few pounds might benefit more from one diet or the other. We don't know. It's also worth noting that the people in this study received significant support on both sides, so the results seen here might not apply to those attempting to lose weight on their own at home.
Well, an interesting thing about that, you might have the impression that it's difficult to do, and even in a big study like this where they hammered nutrition every week or two and then every month, and no. The people who get selected out have you ever volunteered to be in a study? Just ask yourself. If you've ever been in a study, you know that it's kind of difficult to do. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort on your individual level, a lot of forms to fill in. And there have been pretty good studies to show that people who get involved in studies are not kind of normal people. I mean, they're different because, they're willing to go through this kind of difficult process of being in a study. So there, I think, is a way to teach the diet that's so simple, and a proportion of people will be able to follow it without any of these educational programs. In fact, I learned how to do a low-carb diet from my patients doing it without me teaching them. They read a book. 2 patients, back in 1998, if you haven't heard this story before, I was a VA doctor at the ambulatory care clinic in the Durham VA Medical Center. 2 of my patients did the Atkins diet. I didn't tell them to, and that's how I learned about it, because it clearly was successful. And I had concerns about the safety of it, and that's why we started doing studies on it. So the results you can get can be way beyond what this study shows. And you don't necessarily need, don't get under the false impression that you need all that educational stuff, because if you keep it simple, you don't have to have a weekly clinic visit, a lecture that's too difficult. Most of my patients won't do that. So the clinical studies select out people who are different than the average person who's sitting in front of me in my office.
You should be wary of those who tell you that they know what diet is best for you, or that there's a test out there to tell you the same. Successful diets over the long haul are most likely the ones that involve slow and steady changes. The simplest approach, and many have espoused it, including me, is to cut out processed foods, think about the calories you're drinking, and try not to eat more than you intend.
Well, clearly this doctor's not in a weight loss clinic, because people have tried that and it doesn't work. You may have tried that and it hasn't worked yet. So some people have to be on a strict diet that doesn't have any sugar or starch at all. If you have a tendency toward sugar or food addiction, then you need to do a cold turkey cessation of all of those foods. And then it's easy. So it's like taking the Band-Aid off quickly. It makes it easier if you do a full cessation. And so I'm thinking that this is pretty good advice for those who don't necessarily need a clinical level support. But the amount of weight doesn't seem to matter. I've watched on the internet and seen other patients who aren't mine. I haven't taught them. Have you looked on the internet lately about the before and after photos of people losing hundreds of pounds on their own just because they learned a simple method? So you don't necessarily have to have a teacher in a clinic, even if you have a lot of weight to lose. If you have metabolic issues like diabetes, high blood pressure, you're on medication, I urge you to talk to a doctor, a healthcare professional who can help you get off those medicines safely.
Bottom line is that the best diet for you is still the one you'll stick to.
Now that I don't disagree. That I do disagree, doctor. So if you only could stick to cigarette smoking and it was bad for your health, it's still my job as a doctor to get you to quit smoking, right? Okay, that seems weird, right? No, if there's a sugar addiction, and I believe there is, the science says there is, and you still want to have your sugar, then you're not really getting off the foods that are unhealthy for you, even though that's the one you can stick to. So that's the old kind of, okay, low carb, you've got some science there, and low fat's got science, Mediterranean has science. The best diet is the one you can stick to. No. The best diet is the one that gives you the optimal health. And I do agree that you can't really know until you try it, and then you measure these health parameters. So very interesting kind of critique from a sort of a outsider's view, because there's a lot of other low carb, low fat science that doesn't get shown in this one study that he's not aware of.
No one knows better than you what that diet might be, and you're most likely going to have to figure that out for yourself.
Well, we can help you figure that out. So there are a lot of ways to be healthy. A low-carb keto diet has helped many, many people under my watch, and even now, or even on your own, trying it on your own. A couple of things about this review. Just because the low-carb and low-fat are the same, that means they both work. And I've always said that they both work. It's not that one necessarily is better than another, and that's a false sort of competition there. Yes, find the one that works for you, but also gives you the best health outcomes in terms of not only weight, but also the metabolism. You don't have to have diabetes. You don't have to have these other metabolic syndrome, high triglyceride, low HDL. These are things that you can actually address and reverse in a clinical dietary lifestyle program. I hope that's helpful. If you don't have my top 10 tips to start keto right, please look in the description below, and be sure, if you like this, to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on videos in the future. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.